A few years ago, Jonah's life had been a bit of a mess. He'd regularly been working really long hours, often on weekends, and that had taken a heavy toll on his health as well as on his marriage and on his family. Noticing his increased absences at church and small group, one of the elders from his church had invited him, maybe more twisted his arm into, but invited him to go on a men's retreat. Now, Jonah didn't really have the time. He was feeling very overwhelmed. There was a lot of pressures from work. But with some extra encouragement from his wife, he had eventually made arrangements to take a few days to go on this retreat. And in short, the retreat had been life-changing. It was as if God was speaking directly to him about the priorities in his life. And upon leaving that retreat, he committed to making some real lifestyle changes. Over the next several months, he had a conversation with his boss at work about his life and work balances. He made sure that his weekends were reserved for family time as well as for church. And gradually, by doing so, he felt many of the pressures that he had been experiencing start to lift. He even felt like God was now speaking directly into his life, that there was more to being a Christian than just going to church on Sundays or attending a small group on occasion. Jonah actually felt like God wanted him to become a leader in some capacity in the church. He'd always been very good at handling money and leading teams at work, and it seemed that some of those skills would be very useful for God in the church. So Jonah waited and he prayed. The next fall, Jonah's son joined the soccer team. And he seemed to really like it and appreciated his dad, who was now spending more time with him in his activities. But the team needed someone to help coordinate away games, to manage some of the finances, do some fundraising. And soon Jonah found that he was volunteering for many of those jobs. And with that, his weekends began to be filled with all things soccer, from games to practices to fundraisers. And the ideas of church leadership were soon placed on the back burner in his mind. As Jonah spent more time with his son at soccer, he spent less time with God and his family in church-related activities and service. And slowly, those pressures that he had felt a year earlier started to creep back into his life again. And soon, although under different circumstances, Jonah found himself in the same state of mind he had been a few years earlier, feeling like his life was out of balance, not focused on God, and a bit of a mess. Perhaps you can identify in some way with Jonah. You felt like there's something that God has wanted you to do, or a path that he wanted you to go down, but you've become distracted or otherwise absorbed in other things. And the time and energy you should have been spent investing in God and what he wanted for you to do, you've invested in something else. Maybe that was a hobby. Maybe it was a relationship. Maybe it was your children's activities. Maybe it was politics or the school board, or it could even be something that you were doing at church. God had given you a direction to follow, but at some point along the way, you stopped going in that direction and you began to do something else. Maybe a good thing, but your own thing. And thus you stopped following God's lead. Today we're going to be looking at our last message from our Genesis sermon series. This series has taken us through the first 11 chapters in Genesis. We discussed creation, the fall of humanity into sin. We discussed the legacy of Seth and how our legacy is people. And then last week we talked about Noah and the flood. And this week we're going to talk about how even when we intend to follow a path of righteousness and righteous living, sometimes we still get tripped up or distracted in some way. And we'll see how this actually happened to the descendants of Noah. We're going to start this morning by looking in Genesis chapter 9. If you would turn with me there in your Bibles, if you have one, you can also look in the Pew Bibles. It's on page 9 in the Pew Bibles. We're going to be looking at Genesis 9 in verse 1. And it says this in Genesis 9, verse 1. Then God blessed Noah and his sons and said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth." So after the flood was over, Noah and his family and all the animals, they got off the ark. God blessed Noah and his family, and he told them to multiply and fill the whole earth. Every living thing that had been on land prior to that point had been killed, and God wanted essentially to have the people and the animals to spread out again and fill everything back up. And if you were to read Genesis chapter 10, you would see how the people did eventually spread out, how they spread out and filled the whole earth as God intended. Of Noah's 3 sons, their descendants each spread out in different directions. But they didn't actually do that of their own accord. Genesis chapter 10 is kind of an overview of what eventually happened over the next several generations, but Genesis chapter 11 tells what originally happened right after Noah and his family and their immediate descendants got out of the ark after the flood. And if you would turn there with me, it's on page 11 in your Pew Bibles. It starts out okay, and we read about this in Genesis 11, starting in verse 1 and 2. And we read, it says, "Now all the earth used the same language and the same words, and it came about as they journeyed east that they found a plain in the land of Shinar and settled there." Some of your translations use the land of Babylon, but the land of Shinar is the same thing. So all these descendants of Noah, they had the same language, which we would expect. That makes sense since they're all coming from the same family. And they all journeyed east. Good. They were starting to spread out. They were starting to do exactly what God had commanded them to do. And in their spreading out, they came across this plain in the land of Shinar, laid out before them. And again, they were thinking, okay, this looks pretty nice. We'd like to start settling here. And that's good. There's nothing really wrong with them doing that. If you want to make a home for yourself, a plain is a good place to do that, rather than where they had been, which was up in the mountains. Then we read this in Genesis 11, verse 3. "Then they said to one another, 'Come, let's make bricks and fire them thoroughly.' And they used brick for stone, and they used tar for mortar. And they said, 'Come, let's build ourselves a city and a tower whose top will reach into heaven. And let's make a name for ourselves. Otherwise, we will be scattered abroad over the face of all the earth.' So they started to settle in this plain in Shinar. And they decided to build a city, which again, building a city is not in and of itself bad in any way. But we read about the problem coming in verse 4, when they said they wanted to build a city and a tower that reached into heaven. And they wanted to do this for 2 main reasons that it talks about. First, they wanted to make a name for themselves. Look how awesome we are. Look what we can accomplish. We can build this massive tower to heaven. I imagine that God may be somewhat sarcastically kind of giving them a golf clap. Bravo, good job, guys. You can build this amazing tower. I mean, I built the entire earth in 6 days, but your tower's amazing. Good job. Very humbled by your achievements. Now, obviously, they couldn't build a tower that really would reach to heaven. They couldn't actually do that, but they thought that they could. And there was a serious pride issue that they had. They were seeking not to glorify God by what they built, but they were seeking to glorify themselves. And they were not seeking to rely on God. Again, there was this idea, this pride issue here. They wanted to rely on themselves. Almost as if they were saying that they were maybe not individually equal to God, but collectively, all of them together were pretty much equal to God in their abilities. The people were pursuing pride and glory in themselves and their accomplishments. And then the second reason that they stopped to build is that they didn't want to be scattered out across the whole earth. They didn't want to spread out as God had specifically told them to do and commanded. They wanted to stay together because they saw that there was some strength in numbers. There was an advantage for them to all being together. I had an old pastor who used to say that Christians are like manure. When they're spread out, they fertilize the whole earth. They produce crops in abundance. There's a great harvest. It's amazing. But when they're all together, they really stink. And these guys, they decided they wanted to be stinky, right? They weren't going to spread out. They were going to stay together in one spot. As this pandemic has progressed, what I see, particularly in America, but probably elsewhere in the world, I think this is a universal thing, is a similar sort of pride and defiance, kind of an undercurrent that is existing. Americans, even Christians, have adopted not an attitude of humility and seeking after God as we've faced sort of this worldwide pandemic and disease. Instead, we've kind of collectively said, we can overcome this pandemic. We can use science to medicate, to vaccinate, or otherwise protect ourselves from being defeated. We can build a tower in honor of human ingenuity and accomplishment. Now, that's not at all to suggest that science or medical advancement is bad in any way, but the message that we kind of seem to be collectively perpetuating as people is we can overcome this. And now it is increasingly we have overcome this. We have overcome the virus because of what we have accomplished. Yea, us, there's sort of the similar sort of pride issue that is present there. This is a major failing of many of the ethical types of systems or of politics or of lifestyle choices in general that are built on human ideals and not on God and his ideals. We have pride, so we think that we know better than God. And with that pride, we choose our own ways of thinking and are often choosing ways of thinking that are in opposition to God's ways. And even Christians, like I said, can fall prey to this at different times. Take, for example, the philosophies of Unitarianism and objectivism. Unitarianism is essentially the belief that what is best for everybody is that which makes the most number of people happy. What's best for everybody makes the most number of people happy. It's really the favoring of the many over the favoring of the individual. And if you think about it from a political standpoint, many Democrats tend to kind of think this way. Objectivism, on the other hand, is essentially the belief that what is best for everyone is what makes the individual most happy by their own choices. So this is sort of favoring the individual over favoring the many. And if you think about it politically, many Republicans tend to favor this type of view. So when we as Americans start fighting about what is best for everybody, for example, what's best, either to get vaccinated to protect everybody else, or how maybe we should all be able to make our own choices about whether or not we should be vaccinated so we can do what feels best for us and our families. Really, this is a clash between these two philosophies of Unitarianism and objectivism. And the problem with these two philosophies is that God and Christian ethics do not favor the many over the individual, and they do not favor the individual over the many. They don't do either of these two things. Neither of these philosophies is universally or inherently correct. And neither philosophy is inherently Christian. Christian ethics favors the pursuit of the love of God and the love of neighbor as that which is best, to love God and love neighbor. That is the best thing. And while sometimes Unitarianism or objectivism might look like those things, neither of them are those things all the time. And this is why neither socialism or capitalism are necessarily Christian ideals. Sometimes both of them might align with Christianity, but other times neither of them do. The danger is not so much if we favor one philosophy over the other. The danger is when, in our pride, we align ourselves with one philosophy over Christianity, over the Christian philosophy of loving. Because as soon as we do that, rather than continuing to follow God's direction, we stop on the Plane of Shinar and begin building a city and a tower in our own honor, in honor of our ideals and our own choices. Now, sometimes it isn't even us adopting a philosophy. Sometimes it's us adopting a lifestyle, pursuit of retirement, pursuit of health, pursuit of security. Now, none of these things is inherently bad or wrong at all. However, just like the philosophies, neither are any of them automatically the biblical model of how we should be planning our entire lives. Let me ask you, does the God who says, "Don't store up treasure here on earth, where moths eat them and rust destroys them, and where thieves break in and steal, store your treasures in heaven where moths and rust cannot destroy, and thieves do not break in and steal, wherever your treasure is, there the desires of your heart will also be"? Does the God that says that sound like a God who would put retirement on the very top above all things on a priority list? I don't really think so. Let me ask you, does the God who says, "So then, since Christ suffered physical pain, you must arm yourselves with the same attitude he had and be ready to suffer too. For if you have suffered physically for Christ, you have finished with sin"? Does the God who says that sound like a God who would put our physical health as the number one priority above everything else in life? Again, I don't think so. Let me ask you, does the God who says, "Some nations boast in their chariots and horses, but we boast in the name of the Lord our God. Those nations will fall down and collapse, but we will rise up and stand firm"? Does that God sound like a God who puts pursuing worldly security on the top of our priority lists, that everything else kind of gets crafted around? And again, I don't think so. I think the answer to all these questions is no. That is not what God is like. That is not who he is. Not that God is saying that the pursuit of retirement or of health or of security are bad in any way. He's not saying that. But he is saying that if there's a clash between loving our neighbor and loving God, or loving our neighbor and building walls of financial security around ourselves, or bodily security, or physical protection of ourselves, then we are to choose loving our neighbor. That's what we are to be doing, because that is God's way. And if we can boast about a great retirement and good health, and we have this amazingly secure lifestyle, but it's at the cost of loving our neighbor or of loving God, then we have built our own Tower of Babel. The Plane of Shinar represents a choice, a decision to be made, a trial to be overcome, a direction to be followed. Do we continue to follow God and spread out over the entire earth? Or do we stop and build a city and a tower on our own wisdom? The descendants of Noah had pride in what they could do as humans, all of them working together. And with that pride, they thought that they knew what was better for them. Namely, for them, they thought it was to stay in one place rather than spread out as God had commanded. And sometimes, unfortunately, the only way that this type of pride gets dealt with, that it gets rectified, is when reality strikes really hard. The stock market totally tanks, and a lifetime of savings suddenly becomes worthless. Serious illness strikes, and there's nothing that the medical community can do about it. War breaks out, and the security that we thought we once had is suddenly lost. Maybe we don't have quite as much control as we thought. Maybe we should have kept following what God said for us to do in the beginning. And sometimes God intentionally puts these sorts of problems in our paths in order to help rectify our wrong and prideful thinking. Because sometimes it's the only way to get through to us. It's the only way for him to really speak into our lives before we fully go off the rails. In Genesis 11:5, we read about this sort of intervention of God taking place. And it says this, Genesis 11:5. Now the Lord came down to see the city and the tower which the men had built. And the Lord said, Behold, they are one people, and they all have the same language. And this is what they have started to do. And now nothing which they plan to do will be impossible for them. Come, let us go down and there and confuse their language, so that they will not understand one another's speech. So God could see what was going on. The mindset of humanity was headed in this direction, this idea of basically them being able to do whatever they put their minds to without God. They didn't need God. So God saw that he needed to act. Not that God has some sort of a complex that he has to be the center of everybody's attention, that, oh, they're not focusing on me, that's terrible. It's not that God thinks that way. But God is the embodiment of all that is good, all that is true, all that is love. And when we focus on God, we automatically focus on these things. So with the Tower of Babel, God stepped in and he confused their language to break up their unity so that they would once again turn to God. And this may have been the only thing that was really going to get their attention. And the next several verses tell us that the result of that is they stopped building the tower. They stopped building the city. They stopped focusing on their pride, and instead they were sort of forced to scatter across the entire earth like what they were supposed to do and like what we see spoken about in Genesis chapter 10. Hopefully, in God's grace, if and when we stop where we should not and also start to build a tower in our own accomplishments, God will come down and scatter us as well, so that we also do not get stuck on the plains of Shinar. So let's do some personal reflection about this for a moment. Where are you and I in the grand scheme of things? Are we spreading out like God has commanded? Are we building a city and a tower? Is God currently scattering you or me? And to answer these questions, just reflect with me for a moment. What has God told you to do most recently? Has he told you something very specific that you should be doing? What were the last things that God told you to do? And if you can't think of anything, think about what God says in the Bible. What has he said? He said, love God, love neighbor, make disciples, pursue holiness as just a few things. Are you actively doing those things that he has told all of us to do? If you or I find that we are living our lives in such a way where we're kind of just sort of fitting God in when we have time, if you find that you're living a life in such a way that you're only loving other people outside your family on the rare occasion that you might have time, if I find that I am very rarely sharing my faith, if you are not intentionally working to grow other Christians closer to God, building them up to all that they can be as Christians, then it is safe to say that you and I have not been doing what God has commanded us to do. What are we doing instead? What philosophy or lifestyle choice has won over in our minds that we aren't choosing God's way to do what he is telling us to do? It seems, in this case, that we would be building a tower on the plains of Shinar. Are you finding that your life is kind of a mess right now? Does it feel like God maybe is scattering you? Perhaps that is God trying to get through to you, to get your attention, to reorient you back to where your life is around him once again. When I was in college, I chose to walk away from God. That was my choice, to build my own city and my own tower on the plain of Shinar. And honestly, there was probably nothing that anybody could have said or done that would have changed my trajectory, what it was that I was doing. Nothing could have really changed my mind. But God went all Tower of Babel on me. Kind of sounds like a wrestling move. Tower of Babel, yeah. Anyway, he did his Tower of Babel thing to me, and I believe he actually inflicted me with some health problems. And those health problems are what forced me to change the way I looked at things, to look back to him once again. He had to scatter me to the point where that was really all that was left for me to do, to look to him again. And I was actually blessed in that because it worked and it got me off the Plane of Shinar and continuing in the direction that God wanted for me. And it is a blessing to continue to follow God wherever he goes. Think about the lives of the biblical characters such as Peter, Paul, Moses. Think about Mary or Deborah or Ruth. Do you think their lives were fulfilling? I would say they were definitely fulfilling, but they were also very tough lives that they lived. Not in comfortable retirements, not ensuring great health for themselves, and definitely not secure lives. How many people have you known who in the end find that a comfortable retirement or being very safe or secure has been the thing that has given them fulfillment in the end? I know of many who kind of end up not feeling that way at all. They get to that place and maybe even feel like life's kind of boring at that point. Many who have had midlife crises because they wonder really what the point of life is if that's all they've been focused on this whole time. Maybe it actually is that God knows best. Maybe he knows what is really worth pursuing in life, what will ultimately provide us with fulfillment. That making security and safety and things like this our top priorities, even though they might feel right and logical and good in the moment, are really not what we were made for. They were not how God built us. I believe that God intended the life of a Christian to be an epic, all-encompassing journey. That's what it is. It's an epic, all-encompassing journey. And it becomes unsatisfying when we're on the plains of Shinar, and instead of following God in the way that he built us and what he has called us to do, that will lead us to a life that is like this, instead we start to build our own Tower of Babel. Are you building a city and a tower right now? Have you been doing that? Because maybe it's time to knock that tower down and continue to follow God. Let's pray.